Hello, bonjour, welcome. My name is Ignacio Ledesma. I'm the Senior Trade Advisor here at the World Trade Center Winnipeg. I would like to begin today's webinar with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the lands of the Treaty 1 territory and that Manitoba is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Ininu, the Nisuline, and Dakota nations. We acknowledge we are also on the homelands of the Red River Métis, and the northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are ancestral lands of the Inuit. The World Trade Center Winnipeg team respect the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present throughout our nation. Thank you for joining our webinar, The Impact of Culture on Business in International Markets, Mexico, which will be presented by Marvin Hough, President of MIRA. Before we begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. Please send all your webinar questions directly to the chat box at the top of your screen, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end during the Q&A session. For all logical questions, please send them directly to the chat box, and I will answer your questions as soon as I can. You will also receive a PDF copy and recording of this presentation within the next week. Now, let's get started. I would like to introduce our presenter today, Marvin Hough. Marvin draws on 30 years of experience with Export Development Canada. He worked in Mexico for 4 years as a chief rep, and so he knows Mexico. He has experience in the country, and he has served in multiple locations around the world. Marvin is also president of Marvin Hough International Research and Analysis Ltd., and he provides international research and analysis services to Canadian companies, educational institutions, and government departments focused on key strategic markets, including India, China, and Mexico. Welcome, Marvin. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Ignacio, and thank you and Melanie for setting this up. It's always a pleasure to talk to the World Trade Center groups. And actually, at one point, I was responsible for Manitoba for EDC as a regional rep. So I have a little idea of some of the sectors that are covered in Winnipeg and Manitoba generally. And it's a pleasure to talk on this subject because I have a long career and served in different places as mentioned, but culture has always been one of those items or aspects that I have felt that Canadian executives have not paid enough attention to and sort of given lip service or in some cases, kind of assigned somebody to it, but never really paid enough attention to it. So I'm very happy to bring out the point that culture does impact business, and certainly in a market like Mexico, it plays a big role. And it's kind of interesting because, after 30 years of NAFTA, Canada and Mexico, you'd think on the surface should be much closer in understanding each other. But in fact, we're sort of like long lost cousins that have never really got to know each other, and culture is a part of that. So what I propose to cover today, if I can move these down. See here. Having a challenge moving it down at the moment.
You can use the arrow.
There we go. What I propose to cover in the agenda, Canada-Mexico bilateral relations, just touch on that because it is very important, including government-to-government relations. A little bit of overview on culture and models to understand culture. the Mexican business environment and particularly the culture of business in Mexico, and give some practical examples of how it really can impact business, like from the price, product, place, promotion, negotiation point of view. I think it's important to give examples of companies actually either adapting well or not so well, and having some challenge and faux pas, as we call them. And sometimes, the challenges or mistakes result in a crashed deal, but often they result in sort of spinning of wheels and not getting anywhere. And that's important, as time is money. And finally, strategies and tactics for navigating business culture in Mexico. So that's my plan. And I have a fair number of slides, but I think you will be able to, sort of grasp a lot of it quickly, because we have had a lot of interaction with Mexico. And many of you have probably traveled to Mexico. I think there's 2 million Canadians, by the way, who go to Mexico every year. But you go for tourism, and that's not business so much. So I think understanding the business environment will be very important. So if we look broadly at the Canada-Mexico trade relation, we've had 80 years of diplomatic relations, and many aspects of interchange, students coming here, the agriculture workers program, as I mentioned, Canadian tourists going every year, and I go every year at least once to Mexico. So we've got good relations, but the government-to-government relations have not been particularly close in recent years, particularly in the last 6 years or so, with the former president's rule, the sort of populism in Mexico, and a sort of leftist nationalistic approach. But our trade and investment relationship, as probably most of you are aware, has been on the backbone of the NAFTA agreement over 30 years now. The current agreement is called CUSMA for us, the USMCA for the US, and TMEC for Mexico. But it all means the same thing. We have a free trade agreement, which has been totally clouded and in many ways upended by the Trump administration, which we'll talk about. The level of Canadian trade and investment with Mexico is steadily growing. Nearly 55 billion in merchandise trade, bilateral, heavily favored in terms of the volumes towards Mexico, with their exports of auto parts and many agri-food products, etc. Canadian exports at 8.6 billion, canola, autos, industrial machinery, etc. And the reality is, that those statistics don't pick up a lot of what we call transshipments of Canadian equipment going into the U.S. first, and then being exported into Mexico. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the stats. When I was in Mexico, by the way, we used the Mexican import statistics to look at the Canadian volume going in, and it was 2.5 times what the StatsCan numbers showed, because StatsCan shows direct exports from Canada to Mexico. Mexico is our third largest single country trading partner, so it is very significant. And there's a considerable Canadian direct investment in Mexico, amounting to about 40 billion, particularly in mining sector and some of the other industrial sectors. So it's Canada's 9th largest direct investment destination. And, I was based in Mexico City and worked a lot with the CanCham, the Canadian Chamber. There's probably well over 3,000 firms with some sort of presence in Mexico. And some of the big ones you'll be familiar with, like Magna and Scotiabank, who has partnership with Inverlat. They're about the 4th largest banking institution in Mexico, Goldcorp, Bombardier, etc. And it really is the case that they cover a wide variety of sectors, including automotive and agri-food, renewable energy. And there's some exciting, and I think that's a key point, there's some exciting new sectors of opportunity like renewable energy, but many others where small, medium-sized companies from Canada can play a role and penetrate and find their niche area. So our trade relations, are good, but clouded by the current scenario of tariffs and where the negotiations go. But we could be a lot closer. And again, my point is understanding Mexican culture should be on the, on the platform for Canadian companies. So I'll try to fill in a little bit of that. If you look at Mexican market from the Canadian perspective, and just sort of at the very 40,000-foot level, the macro level, these kinds of factors are positive and accelerators. A population of 130 million, an economy of close to 2 trillion, 12th largest in the world. The CUSMA, as we mentioned, the geographic proximity. Although, I will tell you that many of the Canadian companies who think they can service Mexico from here are in for a challenge, because Mexican companies look for Canadian firms and international firms in general to have a presence. So I ran into many situations over the years where, Canadian companies were saying, well, we can fly down and help you with that. But it's not the same as having an on-the-ground presence. The rapidly growing and young consumer market becoming more sophisticated all the time is positive for many sectors. Mexico has a pretty solid banking system, and Spanish banks have invested heavily there, and Scotiabank certainly one, and U.S. banks as well. In terms of ease of doing business, it's certainly in a reasonably good scenario in relative terms. Canada would be 15th in that scale, and Mexico is about 56th, but improving. Skilled workforce is coming along. Many young people are becoming specialists and gradually moving up the scale in terms of their skill sets. And Mexico, as you may know, is quite open in terms of market liberalization, or has been, and has about the same number of free trade agreements as Canada, including with the European Union and other Latin American countries. So it is the case that if you invest in Mexico and work from there, there's a lot of opportunities to work with other markets. And the cost competitiveness of manufacturing certainly is a big draw. In some cases, they're more competitive now than China for certain manufacturing, which is really important in the global context. And digital transformation is happening, and really like an e-commerce expansion or explosion, because Mexicans find ways to keep up, and many of the international firms who have invested there are using e-commerce platforms. So that is a reality in the Mexican market. On the challenges side, the uncertainty is obvious. We don't know where this is all going to come out, whether we're going to have a ongoing trilateral North American arrangement or separate bilaterals. So it's causing confusion and disruption. And no doubt, almost needless to say, businesses don't want uncertainty. So, we're all affected by that, Canada and Mexico. The supply chain disruptions have been big time. And as I mentioned earlier, nationalistic policies of the current government in energy, mining, and other sectors mean that some investors are holding back and not certain about their, the confidence of making investments. Probably the most surprising piece of data here is the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, which I expect some of you are familiar with. It is really composed of surveying executives on their perception of markets where they've dealt. And Mexico continues to rank very low on the scale with a high corruption index. So it is surprising after 30 years of NAFTA and many improvements in certain areas that remains a very high index. There are, within the Mexican market, as again people will be aware, lots of concern about narco-related violence in some regions, and security has to be on your radar screen in all ways, in terms of personal security, data security, business facility security. It is a reality, and in some locales, it's much more prevalent than others, of course. And it can be quite deceptive. I spent 4 years in Mexico City, based in the embassy, the Canadian embassy, in a district called Polanco, which by day is a beautiful place, very calm, nice boutiques and bars and restaurants. And you would never guess that at night muggings happen 3 blocks away on the darker streets. So security is something you always have to be mindful of course. Judicial reform, in terms of the current government, there's some concern internationally about the current reform of the judicial system, which is moving towards more elections of judges. And many people view that as undermining of democratic institutions, and not confident about the reliability of judicial decisions. And that was one of my observations from being in Mexico for a few years, is that the legal systems among the different states were quite different. The results would be quite different, and it was inconsistent. In some states, judges were resigning at strategic times, and chaos were behind it. So it is the reality that the legal system needs to be continually improved. And there's some complexity to the business and tax systems, and labor laws favoring employees are in place, and you have to be aware of them. But I don't want to paint it too dark here, because the issues like these are in many developing markets, and there are many companies who've found their way through challenges and are doing good business, including many Canadian companies. And I put in bold here the language and business culture issues because it's not a something that's so obvious, but it's a factor holding back some of the Canadian companies from doing much more in Mexico, penetrating into the market, finding their niche, and building their business. So those are sort of the overviews, and I'm going to move quickly to point out that there are regional centers of focus in Mexico, big areas like the Guadalajara region, and you see some of the industries there that play a big role, and investors, Tijuana down the coast from California, and lots of activity in food and beverage and telecom, and some of the big investors there. Mexico City region, which is Mexico City is a mega area, and the adjacent towns and cities like Toluca and Puebla and Querétaro play a big role in manufacturing and distribution throughout the country, and many big investors there. And Monterrey in the north, really a powerhouse with manufacturing and automotive in particular, amounting to 11% of Mexico's manufacturing output. So, there are big regional centers that need to be focused on, and that's why you don't think about a Mexican strategy, you think about, your strategy for a particular area. So when we move to culture, I think, many people understand the basics of culture. It reflects a system of learned behavior that are distinguishing characteristics, and culture can be viewed at the national level, the regional, right on down. And the tendency has been to look at culture at the national level and to think about it in terms of everything a group does, but also, the iceberg model is a big part of it, where there's a lot about culture you don't see on the surface. And that certainly is the case in Mexico as well, and it's very important because the values, tastes, expectations, which kind of dictate demand for a product, are not easily viewed until you get to know the counterparts and the country. And there are various models to understand culture in international trade that you might have heard about, and I'll just touch on a couple of them. On the other side, AI models are being used to help bridge the cultural factors in a market and enable companies to bridge language barriers and adapt their strategies and gain insight into consumer behavior. It's really quite amazing that there are now market research companies who can pull together data from markets, including social media data, and present market studies or industry studies in very quick format, drawing on many more sources that were just too hard to pull together before. And so the good news is that if you seek it out, the research materials are there. The data is much better than it used to be, which is extremely important if you're going in with particularly, consumer products into a market like Mexico. You really have to understand, the tastes and values of your consumers and the competition, of course. So when we look at culture, one of the models that you probably have heard about is the Hall model, which kind of divides countries into these to the spectrum of low context cultures all the way to high context cultures. In low context cultures, it really involves explicit communication. What you say is what you mean, sort of thing. And countries there that are typical are the Swiss, the Germans, many Scandinavian countries, and the U.S. and Canada, fall generally towards that end of the scale. On the other end of the scale, the high context cultures involve more implicit communication. You have to, as the saying goes, read between the lines, right? And you're not getting necessarily the full story. I've worked in China, and that's the kind of market where you're not hearing exactly, the thoughts and feelings of people. Mexico is certainly towards that end of the scale. And for example, Mexico business people included unlikely to say no at a point in time where, that's exactly what they're feeling. And you have to learn to adapt. And what this really means is towards high context cultures, Canadian executives need to really work on the relationships and develop the trust, so you learn to understand the genuine views of your counterparts in Mexico. So it's not easy to do that with one or two meetings sometimes, and that causes Canadian firms often to have expectations that they're not getting the real answers, or they're not going to be able to go forward. So that's one model. Another model that's along that line of looking at countries is called the Lewis model, dividing countries into linear, active, multi-active, and reactive types of markets. And here, Mexico certainly is towards the multi-active model, where people are doing many things at one time. They're not inclined to do step by step. They're warm and emotional, and could be impulsive, but they're looking for a counterpart who shows a bit of emotion. And sometimes Canadians are not coming through with that, so it doesn't mean a fast development of a relationship. Canada or Canadian executives generally would be more towards the linear active model, which includes countries like Germany and Switzerland and so on, who take a step-by-step kind of approach. They're very cool and factual and decisive, and always looking for a planned step-by-step approach. And on the other end of the scale, the reactive model that I referred to, China, Vietnam, very much holding back and not being very courteous and amiable, but you're not really finding out what they feel until later. So some of these models are useful, but as I mentioned earlier, you need to think about culture right down to the individual level. And in my experience, sometimes you find in a market like India or China, the individual has had great Western experience and is actually quite aware of many of the Western approaches and policies. So I think the point here is do your homework, learn what you can about Mexican business culture in general, but go down to the region or the city, think about the industry, mining companies, whether they're doing business in Mexico or in the Northwest Territories. There's commonalities there, and they can connect. and understand each other. Professions, lawyers tend to work well cross-border because they got legal terms to refer to. And certain organizations have their own culture and right down to the individual. So always keep in mind that, and I've had people ask me, I'm going to Mexico tomorrow. What are the 5 things I should know about culture? I say, well, who are you going to meet? Where are you going to meet? All of these things are important. And don't get this idea that you can sort of put it in a box. And these are the 5 things for Mexico. If you look at the characteristics, I mentioned high context culture. The family is very important in Mexico. And that means that if you're employing people, the considerations for their family activities will be important. The personal relationships you can't really shortcut. There's a lot of, emphasis on respect and status. So, think about, saving face. People are really concerned about their status in their business, in the society. And in general terms, many of the private companies, the decision making has been heavily at the top towards a kind of paternalistic approach. Some of that is changing, but in some cases, and the implication here is if you're going in to meet with companies, you have to sort of earn your way to the top decision maker. And in order to do that, you have to cover the lower rungs and sometimes get the right kind of entry through recommendations from embassy and other things to be able to do that. So it is a hierarchical system. Emotion plays a big role in decision making in Mexico as well. And there's, as I mentioned, quite an influence of the US and the northern states of Mexico. If you think about Monterrey and the group there called the industrial conglomerates, many of them are operating on very much similar terms to US companies. In Monterrey, there are many conglomerates covering different sectors. And in many ways, they're much more efficient and orderly in their approach, similar to a US company. And the other aspect is religion is important in Mexico and should be given full acknowledgement, and it impacts holidays and many other things that you need to be aware of if you're going into the market. But these are kind of your traditional Mexican cultural characteristics. And, like in many other countries, there's a lot of changes coming along and new companies coming in, international companies investing, and they're bringing change such as moving from more hierarchical structures to more horizontal, increasing digitalization, better balance between personal and professional life, more women taking leadership roles in Mexico, and more innovation, flexibility in the approach, and ethical leadership is gaining importance. Because of reputational risk, many international companies are not willing to go in unless they have solid ethical policies. And sustainability and social responsibility is becoming more important than it was in decades ago. And the ecosystem, as I referred to, is quite exciting in some areas. There's startups that are doing fantastic things in advanced manufacturing, and all kinds of AI applications coming along as well. So it is an exciting market with the old style still in the background and still overlapping to quite a degree. Okay, so I just will re-emphasize, you need to know the region. The Mexico City region, very cosmopolitan, and huge number of international companies, manufacturing, distribution. It's still highly formal and hierarchical, but you know, it's also moving to fast pace. There's 20 million people right in the Mexican City broader region. The South is quite different in terms of pace and more bureaucratic hurdles and red tape. And if you're dealing down there, you're going to find things don't move as quickly and more resistant to change. The North, we covered basically that the culture is closer to the US, and the Central North, a mix of the two, with lots of new tech and manufacturing happening there as well. I just want to give you a quick, points on my own experience and some kind of lessons learned. One of them is, we call this small talk, right? And I think the point is small talk is not small. In Mexico, it's significant. You just don't jump into business, and I've had to deal with that sort of thing with Canadian companies coming down and sort of saying hello, and it's great to be here, and these are the 5 things that I would like to get from you so I can move forward. And it doesn't work that way. So you got to play that role and go through that. And for the Mexican side, they're looking for common points of experience and interest to build a relationship. Canadian companies have not always, been known for following up on some of these meetings initially in Mexico, and that's where we miss some of the activity because others are following up closer. You got to deal with long lunches, and I've been in many of those where you're wondering if what time you're going to get back because your colleagues from Ottawa are wondering where you're at, and they're about to go home, and you're still at lunch, and it doesn't work too well. But you got to deal with that and choose the occasions where you'll go to those long lunches. Meaning you need to do your homework and understand who you're meeting with, and the potential for you to build that business with them. You're also going to find at receptions and things like that you have instant friends and requests for meetings. And I remember being in Mexico at the embassy receptions, and I was, trying to be conscientious and follow up on everything. And I started to learn that not all these meetings are going to come off, and they're sort of options for the Mexican counterpart. But you have to get used to that because Mexican business people go with their flow every day, and it might be that meeting happens, but it might not. And it was just an option in their mind. It wasn't, and I had it on my agenda. So, you got to get used to that. Mexicans love to network and often arrive late and stay late and invite you to things even after the reception. And you got to pick your spots, but it is part of the relationship development. Mexicans are not inclined to say no, and mañana doesn't mean tomorrow. I've covered that. Trade shows, very popular, very active trade shows. Often Canadian companies sort of kind of go through the motions there, where they need to do things and offer things that attract visitors and kind of make a name for themselves. And that's what some of the competitors do. And I found the Canadian companies often very laid back, and they didn't meet as many people, and they didn't get the kinds of references that they were hoping for. The other thing is the old saying of trust but verify is applicable to the market. I recall being involved in trying to determine the real financial statements for a company because there were different versions for different purposes. And, you know, you've got to be thinking trust and verify in all aspects, including in particular your selection of your agent or your partner. You need to go through the full steps of diligence and get references from people you know, etc. Status we've covered is very important. Celebrities play a role. I'm sure you've heard of Salma Hayek, and she's very influential in just one example in advertising and huge billboards in Mexico City. So it is a market of status. You shouldn't arrive in a beat up Volkswagen for your meeting with a key partner. Importance of relationships with personal assistants. I found that was one thing that was a little, it was a very valuable thing to know the personal assistant of a key executive, and often he or she would give you information that was really important for meetings, and just takes that effort to be open to, engage with them and talk with them and accept their coffee and all of that. It comes back to be a big benefit. Spanish, of course, is very important, and Mexicans will certainly appreciate your attempt, even if you're not fluent. When I first went to Mexico, I had a base level of Spanish and worked with my assistant at the embassy, and it really helped to give speeches in Spanish and to get familiar with the kinds of questions. And, soon you're doing 75% of the meeting in Spanish, and then, it's all appreciated. I learned of the importance of, scheduling your colleagues' visits and not having expectations in certain periods of time, including the period from December 12th to January 6th, which in Mexico is called the longest bridge in Mexico, but it's very difficult to get any business done. These are religious holidays through the Day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, right on through to All Kings Day and Christmas in between there. So if you don't know that and you had expectations, you're going to be disappointed. Other things that, are there, and particularly now with a kind of a nationalistic government, local content requirements built into government docs and all of that. It's extremely important to know where you need a partner, a local Mexican partner. Corruption is there, and the biggest advice there is to be very clear upfront on your corporate ethics and restate your position as you go along, because if you don't mention anything one of those days, you're going to have an issue, and it can be more difficult if you're not stating your position up front. Security is an issue in the many cities, and as I said, it can be quite deceptive, and you might think police would be there, but they're conveniently not there due to some corruption. That still happens, and you have to be best prepared for that and avoid those situations, have business continuity plans, all of that, and legal systems I mentioned. And we had some serious business issues with where we had to, follow through on contracts that were not honored, and the legal system in general is quite different from one state to another in delivering decisions. So those are some of my own personal experience that we can talk more about as you like. I just put together a few quick examples of culture impacting business. McDonald's, as you would imagine, adapted their menu considerably to the Mexican market. Campbell's, their soup cans, they made larger soup cans for the Mexican market because of the extended families. From a price point of view, Amazon went in with a low price strategy and really changed the market in a lot of consumer products. Walmart is a good example of a company that adapted to different stores and storefronts and formats for the different segments. And their stores in the South are, related to the indigenous population. So you really have to adapt if you're a kind of company that's trying to do business throughout the whole Mexican market. Netflix is a good example of a company that did local work in their production to appeal to Mexican tastes and not be presenting like a U.S. company who are just bringing in U.S. productions. And they've done quite well in Mexico. One point, as I know there in Winnipeg and Manitoba, there's food exporters looking at Mexico. You might be surprised how many regulations there are. When I was in the embassy, we actually had to have a Canadian officer at the border in Laredo to help deal with the details on customs requirements for labeling and sizing, etc. So be aware and don't assume that because Mexico is part of the NAFTA or CUSMA that it means that it's smooth sailing and you don't have to adapt too much. There's a lot of regulations, particularly on food products. Another company that's adapted well in Mexico is Maple Leaf Foods, where they changed a lot of their HR policies to adapt to Mexico, including some of the labor laws and norms around family. And as I mentioned before, digital trade is happening big time, and it still involves a lot of cultural factors, as you have to be presenting your website in the right way, on the right platforms, with the right payment preferences that fit the market. And again, you have to be down there to figure all that out, but digital trade is going on, and you still need to develop personal relations behind it. Also, I'll just point out, from the point of view of negotiations and that sort of thing, Mexico and Canada are coming from different points of view in many ways. In Mexico, we're looking more for, first of all, friendship and then a legal contract. Canada, it's more towards a legal contract, and then we'll see how the experience goes. And as we mentioned in the characteristics, role of face saving is much higher in Mexico, so you got to be careful how you counter some of the commentary. You can expect more spontaneous activity from the Mexican side, impulsive, and yet it's slower paced on actual movement on negotiation. And the sort of orientation is towards a best bargain in Mexico and more of a cost benefit in the Canadian side. So I think it's obvious from this that you need to find a bridge between where we're coming from and the Mexican mindset, And it's not the case that you need to be adapting all Mexican points of view, but be aware and adapt accordingly to where they're coming from is the key point. And there have been some blunders in Mexico, just like in many other markets. Even McDonald's made some faux pas in terms of their product offerings. You may have heard of the Chevrolet Nova, which didn't go over well from the name point of view, as Nova means does not go, basically. So some of these things seem humorous, but big companies make mistakes as well. Bombardier's activities in Mexico, kind of interesting that they said that they really, their approach was being too assertive in their management style, didn't fit well, and they lost a lot of employees just because they didn't sort of understand the orientation, particularly in central Mexico, where it's more valuing politeness and importance of titles and pleasantries. They were right to the bone, very assertive, we need to do this, and they lost some of their employees in the initial stages. So those are just some things to think about. And finally, my strategies, and I'll just go through these very quickly so we can do some questions. The in-depth market research is essential, and the good news is that you really have more sources, including online market research companies, to help. The due diligence in terms of checking out personally and with your trusted partners, all of the backgrounds is important. Establishing the relationships and follow-up, probably follow-up would be my thing to underline for Canadian companies, is hugely important. Make your investment in cultural understanding, and don't sort of assign it or to one individual. It really should be all of your company reps who are interfacing with Mexico in any way, be familiar with the cultural aspects. Show your local presence, as I've mentioned. I've seen Italian companies beat out Canadians because they had a warehouse and service center on the ground versus Canadian company flying in tomorrow kind of thing. Trade agreements, very important, and Mexico is a part of the CPTPP, which Canada should take advantage of. Adapt your local norms, as we've talked, and remember, buyers are sensitive to price, but also to service. Leverage government support, and that includes the embassy, consulates, EDC, where I worked for many years, Global Affairs, and many other government groups across Canada, World Trade Centers, etc. Engage in the events and get to know people. The CanCham in Mexico City and in other cities in Mexico, extremely helpful. And it's always better to talk to Canadian companies who've done business and get their insight. Think about embracing innovation because it's happening in Mexico, and be mindful of status. And then sort of the etiquette, remember to schedule your appointments in advance and confirm once you're there, and don't be surprised if some of them don't come off. Be mindful of the formalities, address your Mexican partners with appropriate titles, they'll appreciate that. Personal introductions can be very important. There's a lot of business people going into Mexico, and Mexicans look for people in the market who know these people to open the doors. And if you don't have that, you could be finding it much more difficult. Building trust takes time. And it's a point I put in there, don't sidestep requests for info about Canada. What I found was many, business executives were meeting their counterparts in Mexico. Their counterpart would say that he's interested in having his son go to Canada for a university. And if the Canadian company does, he has an opportunity to follow up in a small way by, referring him or asking someone from the embassy to help, it makes a huge difference. But a lot of times the Canadian company sort of ignored it or didn't follow up, and it was a missed opportunity to help build the relationship. Remember that Mexicans tend to conduct business in a non-confrontational way and won't overtly disagree with you. So you have to figure out when they're saying no, even though they're not saying no. Translate all your marketing literature and documents for your dealings into Spanish and make sure it's done well. Failure can really jeopardize your business potential. In some cases, transactions have to go through quite a few levels. And if it's not in Spanish and done well, it's not going to make it through. Engage in the small talk, as I mentioned, and don't count your hours to when you're leaving, kind of thing. If something comes up, extend your stay, and it'll pay off in many ways. And finally, there are certain aspects that you may not be comfortable with. There's Mexican counterparts tend to interact in a much closer physical distance. There may be more formal in some ways. Punctuality is not rigid, as I mentioned. Gifts are, okay, but they're not generally required. Small items are useful and helpful to make a good impression, and for personal assistants and secretaries, it can do great things for you. Be mindful of family obligations, etc. And tipping is appropriate for services. There is a tax in Mexico, like a services value-added tax, but that goes to the government, and the tip locally is important. So that's most of it. I've put on this, Melanie, a couple of videos that I thought were very good, that you're welcome to keep the whole or distribute the whole PowerPoint, but sometimes videos do a good job of kind of highlighting these cultural things, and I thought these two were very good. And I've just to put on here as well a book I wrote about careers in international trade for young professionals who are interested, where I actually did a lot of interviews and drew on my own experience to talk about the roles and the skills and where I thought things were going. So that's available. And the Business Culture Pathfinder covers a number of countries where I set out the sort of cultural characteristics, several case scenarios of international companies working in these countries, and the tactics that similar to what I just covered. And that's available through various sources like Amazon, and it was kind of fun doing because I was able to draw on my own experience, but interview a lot of companies that gave me useful insight. So I think that's it, and I'm very happy if to respond or to reference you to others who I know could help if you have questions or anyone wants to contact me. So with that, I'll turn it back to Melanie. I think we're around an hour anyway, not too.
Yeah, that's all right.
Thank you very much, Marvin, for your insightful presentation. That was excellent. I'm confident, and I know that Mexico is a big market and a huge opportunity for Manitobans and for Canadian companies. I think this topic is very important and is sometimes is underestimated. But as a Latin American, I can say that I I agree with you with everything you said. If you let me translate it, speaking for all Latin Americans, or if you let me give an example, I think in Canada, if you're a company and you ask for quotes to different vendors, you'll start doing business with the cheapest one. That's what a Canadian would do. In Mexico or in Latin American, you'll do business with whoever you get along the most, whoever is your friend, whoever is because for Latin American is who you want to do business with, and then you'll get together and you'll try to find a way to make it work. So I think this is a very important topic. Sometimes people underestimate it, but investing in this, doing your homework, doing some research, trying to find information about all these topics before you go to those markets, before you go to the trade show, I think is incredibly important. So thank you very much, Marvin. I do have a couple questions that I would like to ask you. First of all, about, let's say I'm a Canadian and it's the first time I'm going to Mexico to a trade show. I'm walking the show. How would you approach that conversation? Are there things that you could do differently than going to a trade show in the States or here in Canada?
Yeah, and certainly, you know, as I mentioned, trade shows are a big part of it in many sectors. And, you know, I guess number one, it's very important that you have credibility and you have status at the trade show, Ignacio, as you would understand. So working with, for example, Canadian embassies, Canadian consulates who can support you, put you under their banner, if you will, so you are regarded even before anybody meets you as an important Canadian company interested in doing business. I would say that's number one. You got to have that. And then, you know, the relationship side comes into it, and you have to be open for a relationship. So rather than assign, you know, a junior person, you got to make sure around trade shows there will be events and receptions. So it's not necessarily that you will sit in your booth all day, but you've got to be available and present and profiling yourself where others are, other decision makers and local counterparts are there. And have that attitude that you mentioned earlier, like you got to be thinking relationships. So if you get invited from the trade show out to something that will enhance your relationship, you got to be open to it and not worried about getting back. And you know, that sometimes is a little bit out of the comfort zone, but really important for Mexico, because I totally agree with you. The relationship is number one, and we see where we go from there. You still have to be price competitive and service competitive, but if you don't have the first thing of a good relationship coming, you're not going to get there.
I think that's a great advice. If you go to a trade show in Mexico or in Latin America, keep your agenda open for the evening. And if they invite you to get some tacos or cerveza, go for it.
You bet.
I think it's a great advice. My second question is what things you would do if you're new to the country and you want to find a partner or a distributor. What tools are available for Canadian companies?
Yes, well, of course, as I mentioned, it's very much the case that you have to get out there, and receptions are there through the embassies. I mentioned the CanCham, and they can be particularly important in terms of giving advice and references to matchmaking partners, because it's nothing like hearing from a Canadian company who's been there a good number of years that this group or this company is one that you can rely on and that you should think about. So use those references, go to the events, and reach out to other Canadian companies, because business people talk well to business people, is my experience, and they have insight that you're not even going to get sometimes from the Canadian government embassies and so on. EDC is another great source, because EDC is not just a trade promoter, but they are a trade facilitator through providing financing and other services to Mexican buyers if they buy from Canada. So getting their advice on potential partners is extremely helpful. And from my experience, it's like utilizing all of those government and local agents, or local agencies, I should say, brings you converges down to a short list, and then you're going to have to spend the extra time doing what I said, do that due diligence, visit their premises, and start to build the relationships and use your own feelings as to are you really understanding, and are you really in a good position to go forward with one of those shortlisted players.
Thank you very much. Are there further questions? Please unmute yourself if you want to ask a questions. Well, I think there are no questions then. I think we're on time, Melanie.
Yeah,
I think we're good.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Marvin. Again, this was
thank
a
you.
very good and insightful presentation.
It was my pleasure, and as I mentioned, I'll be very happy to follow up with anyone if you have questions. I wish you all the best. I know that Manitoba companies in general have got some great smaller companies that can find their path into Mexico, and it would be great to hear more success stories from your side, and we'll keep in touch, Ignacio and Melanie, as we go along, as I do quite a few of these presentations, and I'm happy to do further ones for the WTC in Winnipeg.
Thank you very much.